It is Monday again, and we are starting now our fourth week of Better News Daily. And maybe you noticed something a little different about my setup. I was given a good idea by one of the viewers that my background was boring. So no, I did not get a budget suddenly for these videos and buy a banner. This is a repurposed banner from the earlier Better News series I did in January and February. So I chopped it up and stuck it to my dining room wall. And now it's my Better News studio. But thank you for that good idea. We are back to our normal randomizer book of the Bible way of doing these devotionals. I hope you enjoyed the special Easter devotional thoughts. But we are now in the book of Nahum today. Because Friday's video was special and different, it felt strange to run the randomizer at the end of that. So I just did it off camera. And if you don't believe that I actually ran the randomizer, the proof is that we're in the book of Nahum today, which is a book that no one would otherwise choose to go to for a devotional thought. When my computer showed Nahum, I was like, oh, great. Have you read this book recently? I had not, and good grief. So, you know how the prophet Jonah, he is asked to go and preach to Israel's enemies, and he really doesn't like that task. And what city is he asked to go to? Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria. Well, the end result of Jonah's stubborn evangelism to Nineveh was repentance, right? Which really irritated Jonah. Well, Nahum is the follow-up to the book of Jonah because it is another message from God to the people of Nineveh, but it's now more than 100 years after their big conversion story with Jonah, and their repentance definitely didn't stick. We know that the Assyrians, they overthrow the northern kingdom of Israel, and they take all of those people into captivity, and their evil just grows more and more, and God is not happy. He's really not happy. The book of Nahum describes God's wrath and judgment against the people of Nineveh, and he is going to send another nation to overthrow them. And the prophecy describes the violence and shame that Nineveh and Assyria will face at the hands of God. Yikes. Just let me read to you the opening verses of the book. A prophecy concerning Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and vents his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. Whoa. The book goes on to describe that God is mighty and powerful, and he will put a stop to Assyria's evil. And maybe we should just say a word about Assyria's evil. They were the most brutal empire in the ancient world. It's recorded that their general conquering practice was to plunder a city and skin alive all of its leaders. And that's really only to scratch the surface of their violence and immorality. I just don't want to spoil your breakfast appetite. Safe to say, they're pretty bad. There's a reason Jonah didn't want to go there. But now God says, enough is enough. We read this memorable verse in chapter 2, I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. On the list of things that you don't want to hear from God, this might be number one. God sends Nahum to predict that Nineveh and Assyria will be overthrown by another nation. And this is what happens in history. The Babylonians, they come in and they overthrow the Assyrians, and they inherit the Israelites as exiles. So this is a short book. It's only 3 chapters, but it might be the most aggressive book in all of the Old Testament. It's a lot of doom and destruction. I was doing some research on this book to prepare for this and trying to get some ideas for what to talk about. And I came across this article about the book, and the author was describing all of the judgment in the book and the historical context. And then it got to a section heading that read this: Finding the Good News in Nahum. The author then went on to search for the one or two verses in the book that talk about God's protection for the innocent, and he makes a grand point about those texts. But hold on. I have a very important question for this author. Is God's judgment not good news? Think about that. I think many Christians try to do theological gymnastics with the Old Testament in order to, quote, find the good news. But what if that isn't necessary? What if God's judgment against evil and evildoers was actually a good thing? What if it was actually a loving thing? I want you to imagine that you're walking past a playground. Playgrounds were these things that kids used to swing and climb and play together in. Now they're just community art features. Lame pandemic joke. So you're walking past a playground and there are a group of boys. They're all gathered in a huddle laughing. And as you get closer, you see that they're all kicking something. And then you see that it's someone. Another kid smaller than them is on the ground getting beat up while they laugh. Now, what is the loving thing to do? Is it to just keep walking? Boys will be boys, you think to yourself. Well, no, of course not. The loving thing to do is to break up the fight. That is good and just and right and loving for the kid being attacked. Now, I want you to imagine the same scenario, except it's happening at recess and you're the teacher. Do you just break up the fight, make sure the kid is okay, and then go back to grading papers? Well, no, of course not. Why? Because if you just do that, the same thing's going to happen again. So what needs to happen? There needs to be consequences for the bullies. Now, do you give consequences as a way to get even with them, to inflict on them the same pain that they inflicted on the other kid? No. Consequences are preventative, not vengeful. You give consequences so that the same thing doesn't happen again. And this is a loving thing to do. It's an act of love for the kid who was bullied. It will protect them. But it's also a loving thing for the bullies. You know, as an adult, where this kind of behavior will eventually lead, and it's not a good place. And so you want to nip these behaviors in the bud, even if it's unpleasant for them right now. You care about both the bullies and the one bullied too much to let this behavior go on unchecked. Now, this analogy isn't perfect, but we can get a fair amount of mileage out of it when talking about God's judgment. The wrath of God in the Bible is not the Bible's dirty laundry that we need to be ashamed of. It's good news. Good news that God will not let evil and oppression go on unchecked. Theologian N.T. Wright puts it this way: the word judgment carries negative overtones for a good many people in our liberal and post-liberal world. We need to remind ourselves that throughout the Bible, not least in the Psalms, God's coming judgment is a good thing, something to be celebrated, longed for, yearned over. It causes people to shout for joy and the trees of the field to clap their hands. In a world of systematic injustice, bullying, violence, arrogance, and oppression, the thought that there might be a day when the wicked are firmly put in their right place and the poor and weak are given their due is the best news there can be. Faced with a world of rebellion, a world full of exploitation and wickedness, a good God must be a God of judgment. God's eyes are wide open to all of the pain and tragedy that we unleash in his world. And he cares about that. He's slow to anger, yes, but he gets angry. And so do we, sometimes righteously so. We ache for justice. We crave a world made right. And because God is just, his wrath will target the very thing tarnishing his good world: sin. And so my question for you today is this: how do you feel about God's judgment? Does it scare you, bother you, upset you, confuse you? When you read something like Nahum, does it strike you as a positive thing or a negative thing? And whatever your answer is to this question, ask yourself why you feel that way. What reasons do you have for reacting as you do towards God's wrath and judgment? And I'm just going to let this question sit here. I don't want to tell you how you should feel. It's okay to be bothered by passages like this in the Bible. Struggle through them. Pray about them. Talk with other people about them. But I do think that as you wrestle through these kinds of passages, you'll find that, like the quote that we read, a good God must be a God of judgment. And so a last thought for you. Do you know what the name Nahum means? It comes from a Hebrew word that means comforter. Comforter. Now, you might read through the book of Nahum and think to yourself, well, wow, that wasn't comforting at all. In fact, it was just the opposite. But I think if we stop and just think about it for a little bit, I think we'd find that a message like Nahum is comforting, at least for the people of God and for those who are oppressed. We serve a God who, because of his love, will not let evil go on forever. He will get his hands dirty to restore peace and blessing to a world left bruised and bleeding from violence and abuse and sin. And the more that I read the Old Testament, the more comfortable I become with this side of God. So that's my thought for you today. The book of the Bible that we will be in tomorrow will be... Nice delayed pause. Judges. If we weren't in enough violent material already, now to the book of Judges. Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to our channel so you can get these every day in your feed. See you tomorrow.